Hello and welcome to the Weight Free Wellness Podcast. I'm Tara Bachland, your hostess, the creator of Weight Free Wellness Podcast, and the author of You-niversal Self-care, Improved Health Through Self-Understanding. I'm so pleased to have this guest on a second time. It's Nicole Lovald. She is the owner and operator of a local, beautiful wellness and yoga studio. And she's on again today to talk about the how they help people there, that's in particular with PTSD. And so she's sharing from her background of counseling, education and counseling, and also life coaching and yoga as well. So I'm so excited to welcome back Nicole. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great. It's great to be back. I appreciate the invitation.
Well, I am so excited to learn personally more about PTSD. I mean, I think we all, in a way, know what PTSD is, but maybe not like the in-depth. It's kind of like we all know that croissants taste really good, but we don't know what's in them, And it's probably a strange analogy, but I think similarly, like issues like PTSD, we know kind of what it is, but what is it really? And I would love to hear from your background. What is PTSD?
Sure. Well, I've worked with veterans a lot over the years, so most of my experience with post-traumatic stress is in working with veterans. I've worked a little bit with children who are at risk as well, but just to kind of provide that preface that it's mostly working with military service members. Post-traumatic stress is a really normal reaction, actually, to a very abnormal situation. So essentially, when someone is threatened in some way, perceived or real, they will experience increased stress. And so that stress then continues to go with them after the experience, and then it becomes the post-traumatic. So essentially, they have symptoms oftentimes afterwards where they might have a reoccurrence of the trauma. They might be triggered by certain things that bring up that experience of the trauma that they had. And then there's a lot of, obviously, emotional, mental, and physical repercussions or things that happen after their experience. But I think the biggest thing that I've learned over my training and time in working with the Veterans Yoga Project and other veterans organizations is, it truly is a normal reaction, a normal response to a very abnormal situation. So a response to trauma. And so I think oftentimes, particularly with veterans, we label them with this PTSD, with post-traumatic stress, in a way that, sometimes it's frustrating or they don't want to be labeled, right? But I think it's important for everybody to know that it's just a common experience. And anybody who's had trauma, and most people have had some sort of trauma in their life, will likely experience that post-traumatic stress.
I'm curious. I do want to focus on veterans, but I would also kind of like to tie in a little bit of how, what do civilians experience PTSD as well? And so maybe give us a few examples of how you've seen people be triggered into, or how it begins in some people. I mean, we can imagine, of course, a veteran or a soldier going into a literal life and death situation. How are some ways that it is initiated?
A car accident. If somebody has a car accident where they really are terrified enough where they feel that their life is threatened, that can then cause post-traumatic stress. Sexual assault, domestic violence, all those horrible things that you hear about where people, or if someone's mugged, where you truly are worried about your life and about your safety. That's typically when post-traumatic stress is going to occur.
And what kind of triggers do people experience? Like what causes then, this sensitivity?
I worked with the Wounded Warrior Project for a few years where we had a lot of veterans who did have post-traumatic stress. And what I learned, I was hosting events. And what I learned about these events is it was really important for us to make sure that when we took the veterans out, in a group setting, that they knew exactly where the exits were, and that they would know, or we would have to be sure that there weren't any loud noises. Because to answer your question, one of the things that can trigger someone who has been in warfare would be the sounds, really big blasts, like fireworks on the 4th of July, or strobe lights can trigger people, because it's usually something that is associated with what they saw, smelled, felt, experienced while they were there, that can trigger someone. So it's hard to know exactly what that might be, but you try, if you can, you try to put yourself in their situation. So, for example, when someone's in, say, Iraq or Afghanistan, or in a war-torn country, think about the visuals, the things that they might see, smoke. Think about, even flat tires, I know, can be an issue for some people, because as you're going down the streets in, say, Iraq or Afghanistan, oftentimes there were burnt vehicles or vehicles with flat tires and things on the side of the road. So you just have to think about what are the different experiences that they might have had, and their sensations that they had in that moment. And then if they re-experience those same sensations in the now, that's what might bring them back, have them be triggered to bring them back to that place. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. I mean, it probably from the outside, like I would imagine if you're with your partner, your spouse, whoever is suffering from this, it could be hard to understand. But I think what you described really helps to put yourself in their shoes, so to speak, and have a little bit more compassion with what they're going through. Are there certain people that are more, like if two people go through the same situation, is one person more susceptible for or whatever reason, or is it pretty indiscriminate on who comes, I don't know, comes down, who gets it? I don't know what you even really say.
Yeah. That's a great question, because it comes down to resiliency. And everybody, regardless of the stress that they've been under and whether they've experienced post-traumatic stress or not, everybody has different levels of resiliency. So when one person's faced with a certain stress, like let's use something really lighthearted like Christmas, right? We all get stressed out with the holidays and shopping and things like that. Some people, you might have friends that just sail through, the Christmas holidays without seeming stressed, without having any issues, whereas another person might be completely stressed out and overwhelmed and not sleeping. And so it really just comes down to the level of resiliency. And it's, I believe it's born resiliency and also learned resiliency, right? So some of us might just have greater resiliency from the get-go. Some of us learn through practices and over time how to handle life's challenges a little bit better. And I think that's where yoga comes in for everyone, but specifically for people who have experienced trauma, because it helps them to reconnect body, mind, and spirit or soul, and to learn, how to respond when they're starting to get worked up, how to calm themselves when they're starting to get worked up. Because essentially with trauma, people are going to experience, I call it the 3 F's: fight, flight, or freeze. Their bodies are going to either want to fight, aggression, fight, flight, they're going to want to run, or freeze, they're just immobile. They can't respond or react. And so through yoga practices and breath work and also just life coaching strategies, we can help people to learn how to better manage that. And so that's why I think yoga is a really beneficial practice for everybody, right? But specifically for people who have undergone some trauma and have post-traumatic stress.
So how did you specifically get started in training these vets in particular? I mean, you run a fairly, quote, normal yoga studio, but you do special training and coaching for vets. So how did you get into that realm?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't on purpose. I married a service member. So I married my husband 18 years ago, and he was in the military. And so our first 10 years of marriage, we lived on military bases and kind of traveled all over the U.S. and lived in, I think we moved to 7 different states in 5 years. So we lived in a lot of different places on military installations. And I've always worked in social services or some kind of helping profession. And eventually we moved to a small town, Fort Drum, New York, where there were very few jobs. And the only job I could find was working on a military base with service members. And at the time, I was helping them go to college, so more on the education side. But long story short, that was my kind of starting point in terms of working with veterans. And then my career for the last 15 years since then has always been in positions working specifically with service members and their families. So I've worked with Wounded Warrior Project, where we had a lot of veterans who were coming off of the Iraqi wars and the war in Afghanistan. And so when I opened or purchased the wellness studio that I now own, this was just a natural component. I've always wanted to work with veterans, and I always have. So it was natural to try to do things for service members and their families. So we've hosted the Yoga Veterans Project, which is a training program that teaches other yoga teachers how to work with veterans. And so we've helped to, teach other yoga teachers across the state of Minnesota so that they better understand if they have a veteran come into their yoga class, what are some of the things that they can do to help them be more comfortable. And then we've just done a lot of donation-based classes so that we can give back to various veterans organizations. I'm hosting a training this coming April on trauma-sensitive yoga. So the things that we're talking about here, I'm hoping to continue that dialogue with other yoga teachers or just people in the community, regular teachers, social workers, just folks who are working with our service members and veterans around trauma and how to bring yoga into that. So it didn't happen on purpose. It's interesting how my life has just kind of moved in different directions, but a key component has always been working with service members.
It's so interesting. Our lives really are that way too. They're very circuitous in that way. Well, I'm really curious, what are some things, maybe someone lives out of state, it's a podcast, anyone around the world could be listening to this, and maybe their local yoga studio doesn't have specific classes for them, or maybe someone else owns a yoga studio. What are some things to keep in mind that a person can do for themselves experiencing PTSD, or help another person, maybe a student or a client?
Well, first of all, I'll just mention the Veterans Yoga Project. They're a training program that I said we hosted last year, but they train yoga teachers around the U.S. And so they host different programs all over. So if there are any yoga teachers listening and they're wanting some training, they certainly can take a look at their website and see where the trainings are being held and if there's anything close by that they can attend. There are a couple other organizations that are out there that support veterans too in terms of yoga training. So folks could certainly, take a look for those and see if they can find anything. But I think just reaching out to your veterans organizations around and let veterans know that you're interested in teaching yoga classes. I think that's a great way to kind of get your foot in the door and to offer programs or classes for the veterans. But in terms of, what would you do differently if you were going to work with a service member? That was the question, right?
Yeah. Did you give some insight on yeah, please.
Okay. So a couple of tips would be, number one, just to make sure that they feel safe. Because essentially when you experience post-traumatic stress or any kind of trauma, your safety is taken away. So having consistency and offering a safe place is really important. The ways that you can do that is let the people that are in your class or the service members know exactly what's going to happen. So just to set it up and say, okay, first we're going to start with some breathing, and then we might do some movement, and then so really just let them know what to expect so that there's not any surprises. And that in turn will help them feel safe as well. Another thing to think about is how your room is set up. My husband, from the time I've known him to now, anytime we go into a restaurant, he has to sit with his back to the door so he can watch everybody else, because he's always on alert, right? He always has to be watching to see what everyone's doing and to know exactly where the exits are so he can be safe and run out at any time. So I think setting up your room, and this is one thing that I've learned over time too, is to have, usually in a yoga classroom, you have a row and then another row and then another row. So you have people behind you. And veterans don't like that. They don't want people behind them. So maybe set it up in a circle or in another format so that there's not anyone, to their back that they can't see. So I think that's another good tip that, most people don't think about, because it's a very simple thing, but it can make a huge difference. The final thing I would say is just being careful about the language that you use. Particularly in yoga, we have some poses that might have different connotations for a service member. So if you think about corpse pose, and that's Shavasana, the final Shavasana. If I'm teaching a class full of veterans, particularly veterans who maybe just came back from a deployment, I'm certainly not going to say, okay, now we're going to get into corpse pose, because that right there could be a trigger. So just think about the language and make adjustments to the language where it makes sense. You might not want to use a lot of Sanskrit in your class. You might just, because it's a foreign language. So you might just want to use, the English terms of the poses. So I think it's just being really taking a step back, putting yourself in their shoes, and trying to be as aware as you possibly can. And now, with that said, we can't put ourselves in their minds. So being gentle with yourself too, and knowing that you're not going to be perfect, and just to ask questions, to ask the service member, are you comfortable with this? I would never in a class put hands on, do an adjustment and touch a service member or anybody who's experienced trauma without asking them. And actually, I usually wouldn't do it at all. But sometimes once you get to know them, then you might be able to say, are you comfortable with me adjusting you? Or so those are just kind of top of mind, a few of the tips that I could think to provide. Certainly, I'll provide more during the training in April.
Well, those are really great tips. So specific too, but I can imagine how they'd be really, really helpful. And it reminds me of when I first started learning about aromatherapy. And of course, when you learn something new, you're like, oh, this is wonderful for everything and everybody. And you're like, especially with the fragrances, you're like, oh, this smells so good, and you put it under people's noses, or maybe not you, but initially, I think a lot of us who get into that realm. And I remember this one woman that I was around on a regular basis, and it was around the Christmas time like it is now. And I had just gotten a new oil combination. And I think for many of us, the smells of orange and pine and, needles and pine needles smells wonderful. And so I wanted to share something wonderful with her. And she's like, oh, I can't stand that. And I asked her, well, why? What is it about this? Doesn't it smell good? She's like, no, my parents got divorced when I was very young around Christmas time. And she said, anything that, and especially fragrances, of course, right? Fragrance really triggered memories. And that was a really great lesson for me at my early, very anxious age to learn those things, because there are so many, just to be mindful. Of course, as people, we can't know what everybody's triggers are going to be. And that's such a popular word these days, triggers. Of course, be mindful and compassionate, but also there's an element of working together. I'm really curious, are there some stories or something that comes to mind, like how this has really helped someone, in your class, or even a story that you've heard of, or just even the results that you see?
Well, my poor husband, I use him for so many examples, but he might not watch this, so I can use him as an example.
Well, don't worry. I talked about in a previous podcast today, I just talked about my husband and his BO. So you're probably safe.
Oh, no. Well, he's, close to me, near and dear, so I can see how something has changed him on a personal level. So that's why I will use him. I bought a yoga studio. I purchased the yoga studio and wellness center without my husband ever having experienced yoga.
Wow.
He was not a yogi, had not done yoga. And so we decided as we were embarking on this journey that, he needed to be able to at least tell people what yoga was and to have his own experience to speak from. So he willingly decided to go on a yoga retreat with me. And it baby steps, just a weekend long yoga retreat. And so I took him, I guess I was expecting that he wouldn't like it. He wasn't going to enjoy it. Just wasn't his thing, because he's very much the military guy that we stereotype. He's very macho, kind of has an outer shell of toughness, right? And so it's hard to kind of break in and see the soft spot in his spirit. And so he went through this weekend and, said, oh, it was all right. I enjoyed it, that kind of thing. But then he went back to work, and I found out that he had signed up for a continuing yoga class. Mm. So they have every Tuesday, I think it is, they have yoga class at his workplace. And so he signed up to continue to take this yoga. So I've just been very hands off. He's been doing his yoga. He's come into the studio for some classes without me asking or kind of pushing him to do it. And here's what I've seen. What I've noticed over time is that essentially I can say he's become a better dad. And not that he was a bad dad before, but he was somewhat short-tempered, particularly after coming back. He's had several deployments. So as he's come back from deployments, certainly that his fuse was shorter, right? It wouldn't take as much to kind of set him off. And what I've noticed is he's just softer. He's able to respond instead of just blow up and react, especially with our children. He has more resiliency, essentially. Long story short, he has the ability to adjust and to go with the flow and to handle life, just everyday normal challenges with a lot more ease than he used to. And so it's not this crazy, huge, profound story of, he didn't have like a life-changing aha moment in a yoga class. But what I've noticed is just over time, the subtle changes that have happened, and how now he's pretty much addicted to his yoga class. If he doesn't get his weekly yoga class, he's upset because it makes him feel good. It makes his body feel good. I think it clears his mind, and just gives him this place where he can shut down, just let go and relax. And he's never in his life, I've never seen him relax. I've never known him he can't sit on the beach in the sun like I just did. He can't, it's just not a normal thing. I think it's with the military, they're adrenaline junkies oftentimes. And so they're constantly moving, and they're constantly in that fight, flight, or freeze state. And so this has just given him that ability to learn how to self-regulate and calm down. So it's been pretty cool to watch.
That is very cool. And we'll send a special thanks, a shout out to your hubby for letting you share. It's great.
Well, we don't have to tell him.
So I'm curious also, if someone's listening to this and they think that they have signs or maybe have been diagnosed with PTSD, what would you suggest to them? I mean, would you say, is yoga the only answer, or maybe just even from your heart, what would you encourage them?
Yeah. Well, I think finding help is the answer, right? I think oftentimes when people are in a tough place, they are hesitant to reach out or to let people know that they're struggling. We see the suicide rates for veterans are just unbelievable, and it's really sad. And I know it's hard for people to reach out and to ask for that help, but just know that people care about you, they love you, and they want you to seek some support. So to me, that's the number one thing. I don't care if it's yoga or if it's something else. Just, reach out to friends, family, neighbors, whoever, and try to get some help, talk to somebody. Now, if you're looking for some additional ways to learn how to self-regulate and how to build that resiliency and how to calm your body, I certainly think yoga is a fantastic choice. But if you're not ready to jump right in and to dive into the yoga, because, sometimes people see their image or visual that they see of yoga are, people getting into these little pretzel positions. And that's not necessarily what we want for you. That's not necessarily what's going to be most beneficial. What is beneficial is the pranayama, or the breathing practice. The breathing practice that we do in yoga is what truly is going to help anybody who has stress calm their nervous system, learn to relax their mind, learn how to reconnect body and mind. So I think that the breathing practice is the most important piece. Now, whether you find that through yoga, which if you get to your mat and you go to a yoga class, there will be breathing as a part of it. But maybe you can find just some regular breathing practices, either at a yoga studio, or I think a lot of mental health clinics and doctors' offices and stuff are starting to provide more of these as holistic health services or resources. There certainly are a lot of online resources that you can tap into. And then meditation too is a great way for individuals to start to learn how to calm their minds. So one resource I can specifically provide is the UCLA Center for Research on Mindfulness, I believe it's called. And they have some great non-secular meditations that are free, and they're just short, easy to do, 20 minutes or so meditations. And I think that's a great place if you're looking for something after this podcast that you can specifically dive into.
Those are great recommendations. Definitely. There's so many directions I could continue going in, but I think we really summarized a lot of stuff here. I think the only thing that really kind of remains for me is, how sometimes when you're experiencing a really serious condition, you don't sometimes know it. I mean, it may be so obvious and obvious to others, but you may not know it because maybe someone's listening to this podcast and I'm thinking of even experiencing this in my life that certainly are not like being in a war-torn area, but were definitely shocking to the core. How might someone be able to at least develop a little bit of awareness of maybe I should talk about this or just even look into it a little bit? I'm a person that's not all about diagnoses. I don't think that a person wants to go around looking for a diagnosis for everything, but there are times where we have things that we really need to address. We conveniently hide them or inconveniently hide them from ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a natural state that we want to be in, and that's kind of our homeostasis. That's in counseling or psychology, I think they call it the window of tolerance. That's where we want to live, and where our bodies can self-regulate, and our heartbeat is regular, and our blood pressure, and all those things, right? But then there's the hyper-aroused state and the hypo-aroused state, and this might sound kind of clinical, but I'll get to the point. The hyper state is when you experience anxiety. And I think a lot of people who are in this place that we're talking about are either hyper, feeling that anxiousness, or they're hypo, where they're feeling kind of lethargic and depressed. So I think if you're in that anxious state where you feel jittery, right, and your heart is beating in your chest, and you just can't seem to calm down, and you're just reacting, all the time, and you just can't get to that a little bit more natural mellow state, then you need help, right? That's not That's not the way that your body or where your body is supposed to be. And the same thing in regards to the hyper state, which is where you're feeling more depressed. And I'm not saying depressed as an actual DSM, clinical diagnoses. It's more, maybe you don't have the diagnoses, but you're just feeling like, you can't get out of bed in the morning, or you don't have any energy, or you just want to kind of be alone by yourself. You don't want to talk to friends or family, and you're just kind of hibernating and isolating yourself. Again, that's not the natural, for most of us, that's not your natural state. So I think that's where, as hard and as challenging as it is when you're in both of those states, for you to reach out, I think that's when you just call a friend and say, hey, I need to get out of my house, or I need to calm down. Can we go for a walk? Or can we go to a yoga class? Or, whatever it is that you want to do, but something that is healthy, not necessarily going to the bar, right? But finding something that would be beneficial for you in that body state. And as a way for you to connect with someone else who can support you.
Well, very, very well illustrated. That I didn't know what your answer was going to be at all, but that makes total sense. Thank you very much. Well, I think that's a wonderful conclusion to what we were discussing today. And I'll put the resources that you mentioned in the show notes. And please share with the audience where they can learn more about you and maybe some things that you have to offer as well.
Thank you, Tara. Yes, you can learn more about our wellness center at www.spiritofthelakeyoga.com. So spiritofthelakeyoga.com. We also have a Facebook site. We're on Instagram and Twitter, so you can find us on all those social media sites as well. And if you're interested in the training that I mentioned, that is happening on, I'm looking over at it, April 8th and 9th. And you can find that under our workshop, our training tab on the website. So definitely take a look at the website. If you have any questions about what we do, you can reach out directly to me. It's Nicole at spiritofthelakeyoga.com, and I'd be happy to hear from you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us again today. I really appreciated learning more about this topic.
Thank you, Tara. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Take care.